All right, welcome back to another episode of Conversations with Dom, where we help guide your tech journey one story at a time. Hey there, Tech Explorers. I'm your host, Dominic Gomes. Today, we're diving in everything in the tech universe from mentorship to scaling your career. But before we kick this off, please like, comment, and subscribe. Your support lets us know that you like what we're saying and you want to see more of our content. Now, let's jump into today's conversation. I've got a fantastic guest here, Ryan Fix. For some background here, Ryan and I, we worked at a company called Aperio, which was a Salesforce implementation partner, which we can get into what that means later for folks who don't know. But Ryan's a local Oakland resident like myself and has done a variety of roles ranging from operations, project, and program management in the tech industry. So welcome to the show, Ryan. Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Hey, thanks for having me, Dom. Super appreciate it. It's nice that we can actually augment our in-person meetings with very professional ones here. So I'll make sure to be on my best behavior. A little bit about myself, even going back before that. So when I had first started out of college, I was given an opportunity to do a technology that was even not even available at that time to most people, which was a Siebel technology. So it was kind of the predecessor to Salesforce. So I started off in the Siebel consulting world, which was just kind of proper CRM focus. And a lot of that was just a lot of heavy sales, operational things in terms of forecasting, in terms of pipeline management, things that all the traditional college student gets to learn right out of school, which wasn't the case, but really immersed myself in a lot of studies that got me into that really quickly. So that was a great first way to kind of chip my teeth, was to understand things kind of from a very operational, structured background. And then actually, one second here. My internet's like really freezing. Are you good?
You're good.
Okay.
You're good.
Thank you. Sorry about that. So really what started off as like a very kind of untraditional way to get into kind of an operational side within kind of a sales operation or a sales kind of domain or world. It really allowed me to kind of understand the way that things would kind of work behind the scenes, but then really not having that traditional sales background, I always felt like I was playing a little bit of storytelling to people who really had, used the industry or been using technology tools that maybe didn't work or did work. So I was always feel like I was constantly trying to sell myself on understanding process that people had been doing firsthand for many of years. So it was a little bit of an untraditional way to kind of break into the tech world, if you will. And then interestingly enough, after doing that for probably about 2 years and working on probably a good 5 or 6 implementations of traditional CRM or kind of at that time Siebel technologies, I kind of felt like sometimes I was being challenged a lot in terms of maybe my domain expertise. And ironically, I actually pivoted outside of consulting. I don't even think I told you this, but I actually went into an account executive position. I was like, I want to actually sales, because it was like one of those ways where it's like, I need to be able to eat my own dog food that I'm trying to tee up to people out there. And if I thought I had no business actually being in consulting, I certainly had no business being in sales, other than just being a little bit more of an outgoing personality type. But nothing in school kind of really taught me for that. But because I had at least kind of an operational understanding of how forecasting worked in terms of pipeline management, in terms of how to qualify leads, a lot of these things that a CRM package would afford you, it was actually a pretty easy transition into sales. But then just the heavy part of that then was actually just carrying a quota and having a monthly, not just kind of new revenue in terms of commitments, but then also maintaining and farming your existing customers, make sure that the amount that they were billing previously kind of stayed the course, that you weren't losing any business out there to competitors. So it was actually a very complimentary one, but very daunting at the same time. But kind of rose to the challenge and did that for about 3 years. At that point, I think I kind of had a little bit of a crisis. I'm like, well, wait a minute, I've been doing this for 3 years. Even in that kind of sales role, I found myself actually leading a lot of the kind of executive conversations on how we do forecasting at large. How do we basically build pipelines? How do we build reports that we can kind of look at all of the AE's workmanship and kind of deals on a regular basis? But then I'm like, well, where is it that I want to go? And at that time, I actually was like really jonesing to get involved with a startup. So I was like, I think I can find an opportunity where I can do like a little bit of both. I could do consultative types of things, but then I can also sell. So I actually went to a quick startup that was focused on like a new technology at that time. And the funny thing was that like kind of a big promise of what I'd be able to do. And then maybe within like 1 month of being there, I mean, like it was actually a week. They came back to us and they said, "Hey, there's rumors out there that we're going to be getting acquired by Cisco, but those are all rumors. Nothing's going to happen. We're going to stay the course. Go out there and sell." And then I was like on a Friday, and they pulled us back in that next week on a Monday, and they said, "Those weren't rumors. We're getting acquired by Cisco." So that's just the nature of the Silicon Valley, right? Sometimes things just happen so quickly, and what were good intentions fell short by the almighty dollar sign of what would be an acquisition. So I didn't get a really chance to kind of thrive in that startup environment, but I actually found an opportunity. I did actually go through the Cisco acquisition. I was part of that one, but I still felt there was something I want to get more involved in, like kind of lending, again, that consultative background, but then the sales background as well. And when I went over to Cisco, I was doing I was a program manager then at that time. Actually, you shifted from kind of like a sales focus into more like kind of program management. And I had an opportunity to kind of do some competitive research out there of other players that were in this space. It was outdoor wireless technology and indoor wireless technology that we were focused on at Cisco. And I found this small little startup that was actually located over in Sunnyvale. And just curiosity killed the cat. I reached out to them. I saw that they had an opening position for a program manager doing some of the channel activities. And about a month later, I had an offer from them. Obviously they want to bring people over from Cisco that have kind of good pedigree, if you will, even though it's short-lived. And found myself basically running kind of channel operations for the East Coast partners for them, and some even into LATAM as well. And that was great. It was really one of those ones, especially when you're a startup, it's kind of like titles didn't really necessarily matter. It more was a priority to have people that could come in there and basically kind of own something beginning to end, right? And the whole process from when you actually get a lead in to when it can actually be matured into an opportunity. But then when you're in that kind of reseller model, when we were the distributor or manufacturer of these devices, we would work really closely with farming a lot of those out to our channel partners to do the actual selling and engagement. So we might actually help with the informational piece, but then we would actually get into more of the details on how to have our partners do the selling.
And I'll just for viewers on here who don't understand what that means. So a lot of times you'll have companies, right? Like if you go to a company and you're a business and you're trying to buy, right? Sometimes you can buy directly from them. That's direct sales, basically, where B2B direct sales, business to business direct sales. But some of these other companies have different ways to sell, and they have these third parties that you call, the channel or partners. So there could be folks that resell part of your solution as part of a bigger service, as a bigger offering, or they're distributors where it goes through them and they're combining with other solutions. So there's a bunch of different ways that companies can make money. It doesn't mean that I'm selling directly to you. It means I'm selling through something else.
Great explanation. And even with that one, it's a two-tier distribution channel, right? Manufacturer, partner, and then within each of those tiers that you go down to that second tier, we give respective discounts to incentivize them to make sure that they are selling the product on our behalf. Just because our sales team wasn't as big, maybe as we're some like a CDE, or there's a number of other ones that are out there in these respective spaces. So good explanation, Dom. And I know I'm giving you the kind of the long-winded approach in this one, so we'll essentially.
No. It's good. It's good to hear it because, like I said, I find it interesting because you mostly hear people that you don't hear many people that like start in sort of like a consulting type of role, then move back into sales, then kind of move back into it.
Right.
It's either they started off in sales and then kind of got into consulting, or they went down sales and they stayed with it.
Yeah.
And then kind of move, but then the fact that you kind of did the channel aspect of it too means you've seen pretty much every aspect of like sales and distribution, basically.
Yeah, it was pretty unique, to be honest. And some people kind of relish in those environments. I liked it because I like to be very process oriented in the way that I go about delivery of things. But then I also really like the interactive nature of human connection, right? And building relationships. trying to identify needs that a customer may have, or a reseller in these cases, to then put before the customer, right? You can kind of like, it's the best of both worlds, basically. And again, sometimes it starts off one versus the other. Sometimes you can start off as a salesperson and then get really kind of burned out on that, and then you want to go into kind of more of a structured operational thing. Or in this case, I started off with more of an operational background, but felt the need to be out there and actually pushing myself to take on more of the sales responsibilities. And some of that, and I glossed right over that at the beginning, was a monetary component as well, right? If you looked at some of the things that you could be afforded in kind of a operational or program management type of position, it paid good. And this is, a long time ago. This is almost 20 years ago. And at that time, right out of college, it felt like $1 million, right? But then when I switched over to the account executive work that I was doing, I mentioned earlier, what felt like $1 million in that program management role, well, certainly when I went into a sales, it felt like a $5 million role. It just, the upside was so much more incremental. So naturally, if you're incentivized by money, that's a great way to do it. But sometimes the payoff for those program types of positions, you have to invest a lot more and go through a lot of the hierarchy to kind of build yourself up before you start to see the monetary component. So there's no wrong path. It's just, if you're willing to kind of delay some of those gratifications, maybe stay on more of the program operational sides and then reap the benefits later, versus some of the sales ones, it's like, man, it's like right out of the gates, and that money can certainly come in a lot more quickly, probably, than the other direction.
Yeah, it kind of comes down to exactly what you're saying, right? Like, what drives you? Do you like the aspect of working directly with customers and like getting deals done? Do you like that? And again, you might just be driven towards that. But sometimes if you like doing the bigger picture things, right? Of like, hey, I see what the transactions are sort of like at the ground level, but I like being up at the highest end of, say, like the pyramid, and kind of seeing what's going down there. Like that might be more your style. Yeah.
Absolutely. And there's no wrong or right path, right? Sometimes you have to chip your teeth on one or the other to realize what it is you do or you don't like. And it's not to say that one is better than the next. One can be better at one company and one could be worse than another company, right? It might be really good to be on an operational side of the company, but from a sales perspective, if you have the wrong kind of management, if you have the wrong type of sales methodologies, channels, approaches that are out there, it's going to be terrible, right? So again, it's a really a bit of the luck of the dice, or the roll of the dice out there, to figure out which one's going to work best for you. But most importantly is not to get discouraged, right? Just to kind of like find out what you're willing to invest in terms of time. Everyone's needs are obviously a little bit different from one to the next.
So you kind of were doing channels, but then I remember, like, when you and I met up, you already had kind of a Siebel background.
Right.
How'd you end up getting kind of exposed to like Salesforce and all these like applications? Which, again, if you already had a Siebel background, like there was probably that time where half of the customers we were talking to were trying to get off of Siebel and go on to Salesforce.
Totally. Yeah, and it was even it was a weird stage during that time, right? Because not only was Siebel and Oracle were kind of like constantly battling things out, right? And Oracle, as I recall, was kind of that big think tank where a lot of the Salesforce people came from ultimately, right? And I think even Benioff ultimately kind of went that path, right? That they were all Oracle people. My memory serves me right. So, so you heard rumblings about it, right? Oracle would win a few deals against Siebel, but not very many. But then all of a sudden, like, the Salesforce was like building momentum, and was once kind of like a real, like, kind of small to medium business emphasis and push for them, quickly became something a little bit more oriented to like the large enterprises that were out there, right? And I think it was at one of the startups that I had gone to. I remember doing Oracle at that first big sales job that I had. It was a very natural transition, the same objects, all those things. But it wasn't until I went to that one small startup that they were using Salesforce, I was like, I can figure this out. And from the configuration standpoint, very similar to a Siebel. It was obviously more web-based SaaS model that was super easy and more efficient to deliver, which is why kind of the death of Siebel happened. But yeah, it was kind of trial by fire. You know, when you're working at a startup, sometimes you just have to have the interest to take things on, and I did. And before you know it, like, Salesforce started becoming this monster. I went on, got the certification at an early stage, and then even after being in that sales job for a number of years, like, ultimately I went into another big tech company at that time. I haven't named any of the ones, but NetApp, and NetApp was doing a big Salesforce implementation. So I had already had my Salesforce. Oh gosh, what are the certifications? 295. Oh man, it's been a minute. Whatever the initial certification was, it was out there. But that was a highly coveted thing. Not a lot of people were doing Salesforce at that time. They were doing a big implementation to it, and it just spiraled, right? I mean, Salesforce just had this like newfounded energy in terms of just WYSIWYG type of format. The way that you would basically implement it, the way that got delivered was so fast, and they were just chalking up some major wins. And before you know it, I was just like, this is the momentum to follow. Salesforce is going to be the kind of the golden knight out there in terms of solutions, and it did. I lucked out just by the virtue of timing.
Well, yeah, and it's funny because like I said, I'm always going to be pretty passionate about Salesforce because I was kind of like I did it for 10 years, and I felt
Sure.
like it was a very easy way to understand application applications in general. Like
Right.
it gives you a little back end, you understand what objects are, you understand
Totally.
what UI is through page layouts. You can make they don't use Visual Force pages much anymore, but like lightning components, all these things that you got now. But um I was gonna say, just because you kind of had that background of like how it worked with Siebel, how much you kind of mentioned it, but like how much of it was just a natural progression to be like, all right, I could go ahead and learn Salesforce because
Mhm.
very similar concepts, right?
Very, very transferable.
Yeah, yeah,
And
yeah,
especially like within sales process, like sales processes that are out there, uh, especially, kind of back in the early 2000s, there was not a lot of different complexities from like one methodology to the next that were out there. Now there's so many different methodologies. It's crazy. But at least at that time, it was very transferable from one technology to the next. The objects were relatively similar.
yeah.
Um, so it was very easy to adopt. And again, I think really what Salesforce had that the other ones didn't was just the kind of the way in which like the
The
object
SaaS
oriented.
model.
Yeah, just the way that it was built was just so much easier. Like you didn't have to do check-ins, you didn't have to have separate repositories. Like everything was basically like live real time, right? When you were dealing with Siebel, it was like, okay, are we all using the same repository? It has to go down to each client. Each client needs to have this installed on their machine to make sure that it renders correctly. Like Salesforce had like none of that. It was like, you know, client server type
Browser.
of architecture. Yeah, like it made it so easy, right? Like people are just like, how can this is sorcery. Like this is why would you do something like this? But it really cut down in terms of the delivery times and in rollouts. It was amazing at that time.
So, and I think that's the thing I like to I'll bring up for viewers here is just in general because you kind of hinted on it too. Is take what you're doing today. Like if you know something about sales process, or you know
Mhm.
something about accounting, you know
Right.
something about like what are systems that you could be using today, and use that as sort of the basis, right? To think like, all right, maybe I need to know more about that system, and that can kind of drive you
Yep.
towards getting more into a textile career, whether it's project management or whether it's maybe going to that company and like maybe trying to sell their products at some point, right?
Mhm. It's a bit of a choose your own adventure, right? I mean, just even by the
Exactly.
virtue of each project that I was getting involved on in my consulting world, each time I had exposure with different client contacts, right? Sometimes it might have been a VP of sales, right? It was a smaller firm. So I had a lot more of an intimate kind of interaction with those stakeholders to deliver something, right? So it was like all of a sudden, it was like going directly to the source, right, of how they wanted to roll out their sales organization. But then it could have been like a more complex rollout. And, a big client that we had at that time, what was the name of the big one? Extreme Networks was a big one, like back in the early 2000s. It was a very layered, structured organization. So, I wasn't working with like a VP of sales. I'd be working with more of like a sales admin. So I was getting
Hmm.
kind of bits and pieces to the overall solution of what we wanted to deliver. So sometimes maybe I didn't necessarily understand all of the components as to why it would be managed by maybe a sales administrator or sales support specialist. And then they would then kind of push that back into their organization. So each project is going to give you more exposure and understanding as to how to do something. And then it's just like once you kind of find those opportunities where either you shine in or other ones you're like, man, that was not ideal, not the kind of position I want to be in. But at least that's kind of an opportunity for you to go back and then assess where you want to be in your career and say, I want to be in an area where I'm interfacing maybe a bit more with executives, or maybe I'm more comfortable just doing the setup and the build out on these things. Like I don't need all the glory. I don't need to have all of the accolades that come along. I just want to deliver it and I just want to learn it. And in maybe 5 or 10 years, we can reassess. But each person's going to have a different journey of where they get to and why.
Well, even with that, like, because you had a good mixture of doing consulting, but also going in-house. For someone that's early in their career, or maybe not even early, but if they're trying to break in, where do you see that there's probably more opportunities? Would you say it's more on the consultant side where you're working with clients, or how hard is it to get in like in-house nowadays, you'd say?
That's a good question. I think, what I found by and large is I've seen it almost in two ways. There's not like a one size fits all model, right? So, when we were at Aperio together,
Man, they were hiring like crazy, man. It was insane.
They were hiring like crazy because there was no shortage of projects that were out there. Everybody and their neighbor wanted to do Salesforce, right? So the nice thing with that is that Aperio did a great job of kind of standardizing the way in which we had kind of the was it the Aperio way? Was that kind of the way in which
the Aperio way? Yep, the methodology.
Aperio way, right? It's like tattooed across the chest. Tupac Thug Life. We had the Aperio way across our chest, right? But the nice thing with that though is it was kind of a cookie cutter model, right? So when they deliver that out to an incoming class of new consultants, we can be fairly cookie cutter across the programs and projects that we deliver. The problem with like bigger organizations is sometimes they don't necessarily have those types of best practices that have been gleaned from a multitude of projects. They don't have the ability to invest in a formal PMO or any sort of delivery model. So that's the benefit of going into the consultative world, is I feel that they're heavily investing in terms of those best practices because they can say, we've done this for 10 or 20 different clients. Now we can deliver it for you. You can kind of ride the waves of what we've been able to learn from those other ones. But big companies just don't have the operational costs to go and build those out. Usually that has to mature over a long period of time. So from what I've found is I would prefer the latter. I would prefer going into more of a consultative type of position first. And I've had friends that have started off at the Accentures of the world. I started off at the small.
So did I.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. I started off at this small little boutique firm that was called Choreo. We were a consultative practice within a company that was doing application service providing. So they were basically hosting these applications before they were web-based. So I would always say, like, try to identify areas that will help you grow domain, not just domain expertise in terms of like an application, but just like the best ways in which you would want to be serving as, like, say, a consultant or someone who's gathering requirements, documenting things, building training materials, like really building the foundation for how something will be delivered. Because if you do that X number of times over for the same client multiple times or multiple clients one time each, what you're now doing is you're amassing a wealth of knowledge, but under the umbrella of like one company, without having to say, like, hey, I worked at 5 different companies. I've only worked there for 6 months each, but you've got one company you've worked at for 3 years. And now you can say, I can then parlay that into so many other opportunities, whether that's for another bigger consulting firm or whether you take on a leadership role, maybe directly through a company.
Yeah, I would say for folks that might be listening to this that are in college right now or looking for that job, like I know like the Accentures, Deloitte's, they really like to try to train folks out the gate, straight out of college too. Same thing with smaller firms. I didn't go directly after, but those skills that I learned even from my time at Accenture, like, has helped me out in every other role. I think my take, and I've had this conversation, it's funny too as well, because I always look at it as like consulting and sales. Like if you ask me, they all end up blending together because
Sure.
I feel like sales is consulting and consulting is sales.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Mutually inclusive, man. You can't have one without the other, right? There's certainly a component that you can draw from each one. And but again, I think it's the truly successful people are the ones that can kind of navigate the waters and realize that each one serves its own specific function. And again, the more opportunities you get involved on, then you can kind of say, like, which one do you start to gravitate a little bit more. Again, and it can come out.
It can change. It's changed to me. Like I'm closer to sales now when I wasn't after a long time. Yeah,
for sure. And it's funny, like I'm going through a season now where I'm kind of being more involved on the consultative side and less on the sales portion, right? And there's like a part of me, it's kind of like, I feel like kind of like caged up a little bit. I'm like, wait a minute, my nature is to be engaged and building the excitement for something to come. but that's okay. I can find those same types of uh, kind of opportunities, if you will, no pun intended, within kind of that project management side of things, right? So you're almost sometimes even selling within the domain of rolling out a project or rolling out a program. Is how do you kind of like build up that interest and intrigue from your stakeholders to sign off on things? I mean, that is a sale at the end of the day, right? It just is all the lens of how you look at it and the way you get. But again, some people just really don't want to have the same people all the time. They want to see multiple faces, different papers to sign. Everyone's different.
So from your point of view, because if you've done consulting, you've done program management, you've done project management,
Mhm.
what if you were going to give some advice to someone who wanted to kind of get into it right now? Is it easier to try to? I guess it depends. There's lots of different types, but is there? Let's say it's kind of like the stuff we did.
Sure.
Is it easier to go straight down a path of doing pure project management type of stuff, or should you try to learn an application, try to learn a solution, the user story creation, and all that stuff? Like, because I feel like what I found is, at least on
Mhm.
my side, like knowing what goes into an application or how to write a user story, how to do business requirements gathering.
Right.
I know you
Right.
kind of sit up at the top as a project manager, but having a great insight into how to
Right.
estimate those, what road blockers are. So I want to get your perspective because
Good one.
you've done both. You've done it all.
Yeah, it's a good question. You never really want to. I lucked out, I think, a little bit. I was at that time, I'd kind of look at myself as more of like a one-trick pony, right? Was that I had that really heavy emphasis on Siebel, and that's because Siebel at that
Siebel,
time
yeah.
was like that was the gold standard, like that was it, right? And then fortunately, though, it was like it was a nice natural transition that it went into a Salesforce because it applied the same type of logic and the same type of object orientation to it. So it'd be like transitioning from, I don't know, like a Ferrari to a Lamborghini or something like that, right? There's some probably subtle nuances, and the real big car buffs would probably rebuke me for saying something like that. But in essence, like you get the general gist of it. It's not like you're transitioning from like a Pontiac.
Yeah.
Do you make Pontiacs anymore? Are those even out there?
I
Probably
don't
bad.
think they do.
Okay, I think those are.
Pontiac Aztec, Breaking Bad. Sorry.
But yeah, going from like a more of like a Buick, if you will, into a Lamborghini, totally night and day difference. But back to your question, I think the way that I would look at that is I wouldn't bet the farm on a technology per se, just because things can kind of come in and out of
Change.
favor a little bit, and sometimes even like in the Salesforce world, it's so saturated right now. And I think your opportunity sometimes when you go in on an application, you have to be so streamlined and focus on like a specific area, right? Even the times in my career is like, hey, you're going to be in a part of a Salesforce implementation, but you're going to own this one specific little tiny module of that, and that's the support piece. Or you're going to own leads or the lead conversion process, right? It's like okay, but it's like you're not really getting a look at the entire, puzzle, if you will. You're getting like that one small corner that you fill in, and then everybody puts in the rest, and you're like, "Wait, what was built here? Like, I know I built that corner, but I don't see what else was happening there." Versus if you would take that same analogy and say, "You know what? I don't want to necessarily build out this puzzle that is going to deliver this thing, but I want to understand the whole process of how you build a puzzle. You start with the edges first, and then when you fill in the edges, then you start looking for the color patterns and going in there." So I think if you have more of that consultative background, if you're so fortunate to get involved and get in there, if you're given the choice between one or the two, I'm all about process orientation. I'm all about finding ways to make repeatable, actionable movements that can span the masses across technology. It doesn't matter if you're doing a Salesforce or if you're doing a Marketo or if you're doing a whatever the next big one is out there, OpenAI, whatever type of thing is out there. If you understand process orientation, the technology will naturally come. I think you can learn the technology faster than if you just try to cobble your way through process because you'll get exposed really quickly for that.
I mean, I think that's great advice because I feel like I did the opposite first. If I kind of just like went all in on Salesforce,
Right.
it gave me exposure to where the real problems aren't necessarily the technology. It's people and process half the time. Like we always use the people process technology.
Oh yeah,
Technology is there,
absolutely.
but if the people aren't bought in, that's an issue. And if the process isn't great, that's an issue too. You
Absolutely.
can make technology do whatever you want, but if the people don't adopt it and the process is bad, there's the issue. So you kind of have to up level the conversation and ask why. Like, why are you doing it this way?
Yeah. And I mean, especially like when you go, I mean, early stages of projects when you're doing an initial early discovery and you're kind of identifying like what are all the components that are going to build up those Salesforce things. Bring in the experts there. Like the experts will tell you kind of all the pieces that you want to plug in or don't need to plug in. But if you understand a framework for the stages that you need to take a customer through from the initial identification of whether or not they're going to use the tool, but then here's the way in which it's going to get delivered in an iterative fashion to then build up into something that is, whether it's a big bang delivery or a phased approach, like if you can understand and take the customer through a journey and explain to them the stages that they're going to go through in order to get certain pieces of a Salesforce, that makes a lot more sense than just basically saying like, we're going to give you Salesforce and we're going to just all go in on this one. It's going to be a big waterfall delivery at the end. You're going to have something big and massive. And I just don't think that approach works super well all the time. But yeah, I'm a firm believer in process orientation, taking people through
Yeah.
stages, building a journey, then ultimately letting them kind of fill in the gaps with some of the technology pieces.
Yeah, I mean, it makes sense because at the end of the day, the technology is supposed to be there to help you out, right? If it's just there and you're like, well, this is the way we do it because that's how the software works. You got to make that determination, right?
Right.
Of okay, is there something wrong with how we configured this, or do we need to relook at the process? And
Right.
I think that's like the most valuable skills that I've learned in general in consulting that have helped me out even in sales
Mm.
is that people process technology paradigm because that's what it's all about, at least in tech consulting, tech
Sure.
sales, like in anything you're doing. Um, but no, I mean, and I guess kind of like switching gears a little bit. So, you've done project management, you've done program management. For folks that really don't understand what you mean by programs, like
Sure.
what is a program related to a project for the most
For
part
sure.
from your point of view?
Yeah, no, I even like to kind of dumb it down a little bit, right? Let's even like switch the words out a little bit in terms of what's the output of a program versus a project, right? Everybody can go on to Google and type in what is the difference between a program and versus a project, right? But really, if you kind of look at the notion of like what you get out of a project is outputs, ultimately, or deliverables, right? Versus like things in a program is more oriented towards like benefits or objectives, things that will help the organization at large, right? So I've always kind of looked at those two ways to kind of delineate the two. And some people will say things like, "Well, all the programs are just projects that fall underneath them." It's like,
Collections of projects, right?
yeah,
Basically,
yeah,
that's
that's a
what
cop
people
out.
think.
That's a quick, easy way to kind of say it, right? But I mean, ultimately, when you start looking at the notion of projects, like they can span across multiple programs. That they could be very interrelated and stuff like that. Some are short term, some are very long lived in terms of the notion of projects. But really, I think of it more from that orientation of again outputs versus kind of benefits, right? The programs are going to be something built out at large that span business challenges or needs that get resolved out there. Projects can certainly be a part of that, right? But as you talked about as well, like there's other components that can go into resolving some of those things. So, but some of the programs could be more oriented around technology. Some of the programs could be more oriented around the HR function and other areas of the business that can contribute to that one, right? So yeah, I think that's kind of a good guiding light out there. Again, like here's the funny thing that I've learned as well. We were joking about it a little bit, but sometimes you go to one company to the next, and what you may read out is say, "Hey, this is what the difference is between a program and a project," and then you go to the company there, and they'll tell you completely the opposite of what you just read. So to go out there, I don't want to be the authoritative voice on what is and what isn't, but ultimately, it's kind of like one of those things when you go to a company that you're at, research it a little bit, like help understand what their needs are in those ones. Don't try to think through, maybe go ahead and change that whole model of the way that they deliver projects versus programs, but just to be cognizant and aware of it, because again, everyone has slight little differences in terms of what they call one to the next.
Yeah, it's very common. I feel like in the tech industry in general, even like in my role, where you hear solutions consultant, solutions engineer, pre-sales engineer, sales
Mhm.
consultant. Like there's a bunch of titles that are effectively all the same thing, but they mean different things to different companies. I think to the flip side around the program thing, I've always had this. I was just talking about this with a colleague the other day that like CSMs in general, customer success managers, at every company might be doing something completely different but have the same title. It's like the exact opposite
Absolutely.
problem.
Yep, absolutely. You nailed it, right?
Yeah. But yeah, no, I would say from your point of view, I want to hear more around, like since you've been kind of in all, like areas there between, being on the ground floor. Like, where do you see yourself now? Do you see yourself more into the programs, or
Mhm.
do you like doing projects more?
It's a good question, right? And if you look at the notion of a program, I look at that as having a little bit more long-term solvency, right? Is if you're committed to something as a program, it is like usually a strategic bet that an organization is working on that is going to sustain the test of time. Projects kind of have a beginning date and an end date from when they'll basically start and when they'll end. So I like the idea of being a little bit more program oriented just because there is a little bit more of a commitment from an organization to be investing in, right? So previous worlds, like when I've been at eBay, was responsible for the global tax kind of program, if you will, at large. And that spanned the masses. Like it constantly changed. It ebbed and flowed based upon what the organization was doing around to basically collect and remit on the behalf of buyers and sellers. But ultimately creating a good experience because we all know that tax is such an enjoyable, pleasurable thing to either have to let go of in terms of a transaction, but certainly in terms of end of the year, the things you need to give back to customers to say, here's what was done. But when you understand that notion of a program, I feel there's more opportunities to kind of like really build an intimacy behind it and
Mhm.
ultimately start to think and almost like your role in like programs starts to function. Sometimes you have to like remind yourself, you're like, okay, you're not a product manager anymore. Like you're somebody that has to look at this from the lens of delivery, but you also have to be so close and intimate to understanding all the other things that are being done across the organization so that there's no inconsistencies, right? Sometimes like with a project, you're just like, you know what, we just got one thing we need to deliver. The dependencies and impacts across other people is not huge. All the stakeholders are involved. But sometimes with programs, like you really have to get out of your comfort zone and understanding kind of where all of the impacted people are and making sure that you bring all those people to the table. So I'm always bigger in terms of like kind of the program orientation. If you can get those opportunities, and mostly if the organizations are committed to kind of program orientation, but certainly, projects are an inherent part of it, right? Sometimes they can just be kind of, I won't say done interchangeably, but the same general mechanics are there.
No, I think that makes sense because I think the longer you I kind of look at it, and not to say that it's kind of like the idea of like I don't want to say projects are tactical, but compared to a program, they are, right? Programs strategic in the sense
Mhm.
of it's overlooking everything. Projects are more tactical, and it sounds like kind of the further you up, it feels more of like strategic vision
Right,
versus we're getting this one set of deliverables. Those set of deliverables on a project level can
right.
feed into the strategy, but
Absolutely.
it's kind of like that's kind of how you think about it, right? Is there's more a strategic long term view on that program level versus a project level.
Yeah, there's inherent value that's going to be derived by,
Hmm.
generally speaking, kind of customers, business users, what have you. The program nature really focuses on how do you kind of like shift the needle? How do you make big improvements in terms of sales? How do you make big improvements in terms of customer experience or customer success, if you will, right? Like the program orientation will really help kind of move those big needles out there. And sometimes projects is sometimes about like, on time, under budget, kind of more of the, like you said, the technical components that are measured that sometimes really don't align with like more of the human factor, if you will. Sometimes it's more just about a heavier delivery orientation.
Totally makes sense.
Yeah.
Well, hey, I think we're almost at time here, but I
Yeah.
wanted to ask you just one question, just around, if you were going to give anyone advice to try to get to where you're at in terms of, being in a program management, like what advice would you give anyone to get where you're at in terms of experience?
Yeah, it's a good question, right? It's a bit of a choose your own adventure model out there, right? Just by the virtue of maybe what you're going to read 10,000 things that are out there. If this is the first place that you're started, we're flattered because that's usually not the way that it works. The information that's out there is could be overwhelming, right? But generally, even what I would find, and one thing that we wouldn't talk about is I just do almost like a little bit of a self-assessment. I've even had times throughout my career, like when I've met with like a career coach, right? And I've done some things to kind of take a look at where my strengths are in terms of the areas that I really thrive in, right? If I have a certain nature that tends to be, it could be like a Myers-Briggs things that people are still doing those things to understand, like, are you introverted? Are you extroverted? What types of environments do you like to be in to feel like you're your true self, right? So I always like to say, but even before just jumping in and making bold decisions, like take a little bit of a cognitive, almost kind of a mental approach in terms of like where you think you'll be good at. Don't just assume that your friend is doing something and then you can say, I want to be just like that person because so-and-so is getting paid a lot of money right now. Terrible way to go in, right? It's like jumping in the pool. It's like, well, this guy just jumped into the deep end, so I'm going to go ahead and jump into just like him. You don't have to. You can go walk into the shallow end and then swim across and meet him. It doesn't matter, right? So I'm a firm believer in making sure that the fit is more about what aligns with maybe what your strengths or weaknesses are. And then once you identify those types of things, then you might find to say the job descriptions of things that you're looking at may actually align a little bit more with kind of who you are as a person. So take more of that human element in terms of your decision making of how you want to start your career, and then have goals that you set up for yourself at the end of that year, or maybe the second year, that says, am I achieving the things that I thought I was going to get myself into, or based on what that job description said? And then use those as opportunities as reflection, right? To come back then and say, this is something I feel comfortable about. I like the people that I'm working with. I'm getting opportunities to move up, versus like, well, I'm just doing this because it pays good. And I don't have a good work-life balance. I don't see my friends. All I'm doing is going out and drinking with people. Like, don't do that. Like that's like complete way to burn yourself out, and burn yourself out fast. So yeah, I think the model is, don't necessarily look at about what you think is the right thing to do. Like, take some time, reflect, talk with people who are experts. I said I've met with career coaches along my path. For folks that are still in school, go to a career counselor. There's great resources we always had there. Understand the areas where you think that you'll be set up to be successful or to grow in. And then I think what you'll be able to do then is kind of choose your own path of what might make sense, but then have check-in times to make sure that either you're doing it by yourself, self-reflection, or maybe going back to that person that you met with to say, here's where I feel I'm at versus what I embarked on a year ago. Should I keep going? Should I keep pushing on the throttle? Or should I kind of peel back a little bit, reassess, and start over again?
I think that's insightful, really great advice that a lot of people don't think about. They think what they think they want, but they don't necessarily like know if it actually fits what they should really want. You know what I mean?
Sometimes. Yeah, sometimes again,
Yeah.
it's that kind of you're always measuring yourself against your friends and what they're doing, or what a
Yeah.
family member is doing. It doesn't matter. Like, you get to be your own person. You get to choose your path and do it on your time frame, right? All those other things will sort themselves out over time. But I would say kind of be true to yourself, the things that you feel that will be in your best interest. And then the passion, the money, all those other lovely things will come along the way. But always be happy with yourself first.
Perfect. Well, thanks again for the conversation, Ryan. I guess the last question here is, how can viewers get in touch with you?
I always think that I always forget that. No, I'm available on LinkedIn. I think it's just linkedin.com, whatever that. There's a little something right
I'll
after
tag
it.
you to it, man.
Yeah,
I'll tag you.
tag it down there. But by all means, reach out, put a little plug out there. Just the best way to do it. We'll start there. If that works out, great. Otherwise, they can reach out to you, Dom, and you know how to get a hold of me.
For sure. I'll gladly pass folks along to you. Well, thanks again, Ryan.
You
So
got it.
everyone, just thanks again. Remember to like, share, and subscribe to I'm Breaking Into Tech. And we also do this every Wednesday at 6 p.m. Eastern, 3 p.m. Pacific. Comment below. Let us know the favorite tip from Ryan today. And yes, thanks a lot. Have a great
Awesome.
one.
Thanks all.